My guest, Bart Ehrman, is a New Testament scholar at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's well known for his popular books that often question the reliability of the New Testament.
Jesus says, look, don't you remember what King David did when Abiathar was the high priest? He went into the temple and ate the showbread with his people, with his men, because they were hungry, even though only the priests are supposed to eat it. We had to write a term paper. I wrote a term paper on this passage because this passage says that this took place in the Old Testament when Abiathar was the high priest. But the Old Testament says that it took place when Ahimelech was the high priest, Abiathar's father. So I wrote a 30-page paper arguing that, in fact, even though it says that Abiathar was the high priest, it means that Ahimelech was the high priest. And he liked my paper, gave me an A on the paper. But then at the bottom he said, you know, maybe Mark just made a mistake. And I thought, So once I realized that, it opened the floodgate.
Just said that he went to a priest. And that doesn't mean that the priest that he encountered was the high priest necessarily. In fact, it makes much more sense that he would have encountered someone who was helping. But then when they reached the age of 40, then they stop being of service and they help the ones who are being the priests doing the service. And it would make much more sense that it was the high priest's father who you would encounter first when you arrive, because he's helping the priests, so he would have things ready for them.
Tim McGrew joins me today as well, scholar of philosophy and religion at Western Michigan University, as well as his studies in epistemology.
Tim, for all of our viewers, what is epistemology?
What it means to know something, what it means to be justified in believing something, and then it branches out into all kinds of interesting questions with borders along history, borders along science. So it's a great area to work in. If you want to know how we know what we know, then that's the field you want to look into.
Welcome along to the programme.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much.
Perhaps, Tim, we could begin with you, and because that might be the best place to start, and then you can sort of lay out what you think are Bart's primary critiques and the things that you'd like to respond to in the course of today's programme. You've obviously read Bart's books. What then do you think are the key objections that Bart raises to the historicity of the Gospels?
Bart wants to maintain the position when you really get down to nitty-gritty and you start investigating and reading them horizontally rather than just reading each one as a self-contained story, the difficulties mount up to the point where it's hard to take them as reliable documents.
This is the view that I learned in seminary. This isn't just a bunch of crazy, radical skeptics we're talking about.
The historical discrepancies sometimes turn out to be surprisingly historical confirmations. There are some people who hold that there are theological reasons for placing it in a different spot in the chronology. In Plutarch, right, he'll reorganize things conceptually rather than chronologically. We certainly find conceptual reorganization like that in the Gospels. Matthew puts a bunch of apocalyptic teaching in one place, a bunch of parables in another, a bunch of moral teachings in a third. So this kind of reorganization along conceptual rather than chronological lines is a possibility.
Mm-hmm. Jesus cleansed the temple twice. I don't think he cleansed it twice. If he had cleansed it the first time, he would have been arrested and executed on the spot. So no, he didn't cleanse it at the beginning of his ministry and the end of his ministry, in my opinion. I don't think the details can be right, but I think that basically he went in and he caused a disturbance. Okay. He's probably right.
That would explain why he has to go up in secret to subsequent visits to Jerusalem rather than just strolling in openly. He's already made some enemies.
Mark says he didn't allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And I think if that were actually true, if you have to remember that the temple is this huge facility. You could fit 25 American football fields within the precincts of the
the temple's a very big place, but access to the temple is restricted. There are choke points, and you got to come through the gate, and this is necessary because they had to maintain the purity of the temple. There's one case where, despite their best efforts, some Samaritans came in at Passover. Josephus tells this story. And as soon as the gates opened, they came in and they started distributing bones throughout the temple, closed the whole place down. Why? Well, now it's ritually impure, and the whole place has got to be purified all over again. So,
if Jesus shut down the entire Jewish cult in the temple, then he would have absolutely been arrested on the spot.
Jesus was very popular with the crowds. And I think that we're underestimating the extent to which the presence of a large, maybe somewhat rowdy crowd who's on your side can have a deterrent effect on a group of soldiers being sent in to arrest a man. That's a
so
Jewish
as far as you're
disturbance at the
concerned,
temple.
there's precedence for this could have happened without Romans immediately stepping in to put it down. Bart,
Sure.
quick.
Archelaus sends troops into the temple and slaughters Jews there. But why? It's because those Passover pilgrims got into an argument with a group of Roman soldiers, picked up stones, stoned the Roman soldiers, and most of the soldiers died. Not just some kind of internecine quarrel among Jews, right? Jews versus Jews, some kind of a ruckus. There's a crowd there, and then he's gone. So I think it would be more like the kind of thing we see in Acts in front of Gallio, right? But Gallio doesn't care. He says this is some kind of Jewish thing. Deal with it yourselves.
It's a little ironic that you want to bring up Gallio. I mean, the whole point is they arrested Paul for an internal Jewish dispute. It wasn't because
he was
stoned...
dragged before Gallio by a Jewish mob.
Exactly.
He comes up to Jesus and he says to Jesus, my daughter's sick, and could you come heal her, because she's going to die. And Jesus says, okay. And by this time, the man's daughter's died. So he gets there, and it's too late. She's in the room. She's dead. She's up, and he raises her from the dead. That's Mark's gospel. In Matthew, it says this man Jairus comes up to Jesus and he says, my daughter has just died. Can you do anything about it? So Jesus goes and he raises her from the dead. Okay, but it's like, which was it? It couldn't be both.
Take the small variations in the healing of Jairus' daughter. Right, my daughter is dead. Even now she is dead. She's at the point of death. But,
Ωραία! Ποιος φανταζόταν ότι η Γκλάνδης θα ήταν η ψυχή του πάρτι? Μακάρι να σταματήσει. Νομίζω ότι μόλις τώρα αρχίζει.
Are all expressions the man might have used. And if he used any of them, someone retelling the story might have modified it in a way that he wouldn't have seen as being faithless to the story.
That the scholarly works, like the works of Bart Ehrman, indicate very well.
There is no shadow of time.
Excuse me. So, the scholarly works, these sources come, as he said, about 100 years after Jesus Christ. That Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, first of all, are pen names. We don't know who these guys are.
None of the apostolic fathers, First Clement, Ignatius, the Didache, Polycarp, etc., are these books ever named by apostolic names or even said to be writings by apostles.
I will accept that if by that you mean in the text itself they do not claim to be by certain people.
Number one, both Luke and Acts are written by the same author. They are a prequel and a sequel. The Greek is the same, showing a very educated and articulate man. And so whoever wrote Luke also wrote Acts. And there are occasions in Acts where he says, we went here, we went there, we did this, we said that.
But I think that the first thing that we do in any historical inquiry, right, I'm going to look at the external attestation first.
Additionally, all of the early church fathers, 2nd and 3rd century, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, all agreed and all said Luke wrote the book of Luke.
All of these people contribute to our understanding of who wrote the Gospels by, say, Tertullian,
Clement of Alexandria.
Matthew wrote his Gospel, Mark wrote his Gospel, Luke wrote his Gospel, and that Matthew and John wrote from their recollections of Christ. John specifically was asked to write to cover the details that were missed by the other Gospels.
You mentioned Justin Martyr, but the striking thing of Justin Martyr, of course, is that he quotes Matthew, Mark, and Luke extensively, but never says that they're written by Matthew, Mark, or Luke, and never mentions John either.
And he says that we have the memoirs of the apostles, and he doesn't list them. That Justin Martyr was the teacher of a man called Tatian, and Tatian was the one who wrote the Diatessaron. The term Diatessaron means through the four, is a weaving together of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
The first time that you have anybody of record talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, our books that we are sure are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is Irenaeus. Now, Irenaeus is writing around the year 185, about 100 years after the Gospels were in circulation.
Wrote that Matthew wrote his gospel in Hebrew, and that Luke was a companion of Paul, that Mark was a disciple of Peter, and that John wrote his gospel in Ephesus.
Fragment you mentioned, the Muratorian fragment, I think it's also around the year 180, 185. I think it, like Irenaeus, is closely connected with Rome. It mentions by name Luke and John, and it appears to know Matthew and Mark.
That John wrote his gospel at the urging of his friends, and that Luke wrote his gospel based on the accounts of other people's reports.
Irenaeus is the first one to mention all four authors in what we have. That just looking at catalogs of works said to exist and looking at what we have in hand, we've lost at least 85% of what was there. Eusebius, as recorded in Eusebius, Mark, having been the interpreter of Peter, wrote down what Peter had preached accurately, though not necessarily in order. Matthew wrote the Logia. We can dispute over what that name means, but that he wrote it in an Aramaic tongue. People interpreted it as best they could. Take us back to 125 or so a couple generations earlier. The Clement of Rome quotes the Old Testament all the time without naming the authors of the books. Polycarp, in his letter to the Philippians, quotes the epistles of Paul over and over without saying, this is by Paul. Ignatius of Antioch does the same thing. Always quoting things, very rarely stopping to say, this is the person from whom I am quoting.
Right.
It's almost as though they expected their audience to recognize these things already.
Okay.
The people who assigned the Gospel of John to John the son of Zebedee, the disciple of Jesus, had very clear theological reasons for wanting to say that. And so there is a very strong difference between what we're talking about when we're talking about the Gospels and what we're talking about when referring to the writings of ancient Greek and Roman histories.
And Bart starts talking about people's theological reasons, my tail gets all bushy. To say, well, they had theological reasons for ascribing it to John, I'm sorry, we're talking about people here who were two links away, right? Irenaeus, a disciple of someone who was a hearer of John.
Irenaeus, writing in 180 AD, who was a student of Polycarp, who himself was a student of the Apostle John. And it's important to know that Papias also knew Polycarp.
I don't have a mechanical view of inspiration. I'm simply talking about what most evangelical Christians happen to think. I know this because I'm talking about the people listening to your program. I teach these people all the time.
I think Bart's getting some illicit mileage out of identifying, taking it at face value or inerrancy as a dictation theory. Like I said, that's been out of fashion in evangelical circles for a very long time. I dare say even at Moody, where some of the people who were students at the time Bart was there assure me that they discussed these things without any theory of mechanical inspiration at Moody at that very time. Maybe
do Muslims still use Bart Ehrman arguments to attack Christians?
They always will. It's like using Didat or Zakir Naik or whatever. They'll keep using even though Ehrman doesn't work for them all the time. He in some instances he argues on their behalf, but Muslims will keep using these arguments over and over and over again, even though they've been refuted time and time and time again. That's so sometimes it's a Muslim who's just learning about these arguments for the first time, and they might hear someone quoting Bart Ehrman, and they don't know the answer to these questions. So that's possible. One kind of situation. Another one is that it's the same Muslim just repeating the same thing over and over again, even after being refuted, and they're just being dishonest and making the same arguments. So yes, they are, but we hope that the ones that we answer and the ones that receive answers, we pray that they'll be, consistent or honest, and they'll stop using them and they'll drop Islam and come to the Lord Jesus. That's our hope and that's our prayer.
Thank you very much, brother.